Thanks for having me here today. Thanks for the opportunity to share with you all. So this is another mouthful. Regenerative placemaking, Solutionary's Guide to an Ecological City. Now, it's a very important, you'll see a lot of play on words because our words are very, very, very important in how we act and how we think and how we perceive things. So, my perception comes from the fact that I'm much more in the art, architecture, urban planning, aquaponics, what have you realm. I'm like really confused about labels, so I don't like to use the labels a lot. We're in an era of silos, and we really need to get into an era of being messy with those silos. Because if you just talk about only architecture, only this, only that, the programs and the policies create and reinforce the same structures. Conversations around the city, obviously Chicago, right? The city, as you scale out, is very easy to talk about the evolution of a city. But if you really start to look at the issue of evolution over time and population growth over time and what we're doing to our cities over time and the implications on our waterways, our trash, our waste streams, etc., we're starting to see this really, really profoundly negative way of approaching cities and city planning. So obviously there are the projections about how we're going to be at 11 million people in the greater metropolis by 2040. So there are plans to talk about, well, that's going to have severe implications on our transportation systems, our water. Again, what is the waste streams that impact and continue to impact our water? And how do we preserve water? How do we save water? What are we doing with our building processes? And how do we take some of these empty lots and what do we do with them? Empty buildings, what do we do with them? We are in this era where there are these new industries that pop up dime a dozen, right? Snapchat pops up, estimated 3-point-something billion worth before it even sold $1. And it's a market that came up because people were tired of timelines and Facebook. It just popped up. So we're trying to figure out what is the next set of accessible and sustainable professions and career pathways, not just something that pops up and then disappears. So when you scale this out even further, you look at the Rust Belt. The Rust Belt was, second largest economic paradigm in the world, is a major impactor. And when you keep scaling out, we lost a lot of the jobs. We lost a lot of the, deindustrialization process majorly impacted not just Chicago, Milwaukee, Detroit, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of similarities across the. So you have to think about this micro scale into this bigger picture of the scale of what the cities are. So it's nice to think about growth to a degree, but what is the bipolar opposite of the growth and the decay? Right. While we're choosing to invest in certain areas, we're also choosing to not invest in other areas. It's an active choice. So instead, you have images of these places that are shuttered and frozen for decades, while our homeless situation increases and we have new growth and new condos and luxury condominiums that don't ever get filled. We still have this on the other side. Foreclosures increasing, and it becomes. There's your food access. I wouldn't go there for food or beauty supplies, personally. Just saying, right? And then it becomes an erasure. It's almost like a forced amnesia process. After you've neglected it for so long, it becomes too much of an eyesore, you gotta erase it. Tear it down as some excuse to start something else without any thought or consideration of what could happen within that space. So this term of blight, how many people in the, raise your hand if you're familiar with blight? Are you familiar from an ecological perspective of what blight is, not the city planning? So this is an interesting thing. Blight is actually disease of a plant so that it can no longer sustain life. And it's a term that has been lifted and applied to places, people, communities, buildings, and structures. That's a very tricky utilization of that word blight, if you know what I mean. So all of a sudden now you live in a blighted community. You live in a zombie property, or you're surrounded by zombie properties. It's a very, 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 very complex way of telling somebody that there's no hope there. You're frustrating hope. That's actually lifted from the dictionary. Something that frustrates plans and hopes. I did it too. Becomes a prescriptive pathology of how we're talking about our communities and how we're talking about our development patterns and choices. So in a disinvested neighborhood, there's a lot of intermingled chronic urban problems. There's the deterioration, the physical deterioration, there's the broken windows theory, et cetera, et cetera. But then there's also linked directly poverty, unemployment. Of course, there's health issues, and the environmental impact is atrocious, right? So the soil, the air qualities, the water qualities, it's all interrelated. The education, the collapse of the school systems. So when you scale this out, we start seeing that there are the spatial allocations of where these design patterns are, and then over time, we're also looking at our health collapse, right? A lot of the treatments are impacting us with cancerous development. The rate of cancer growth is out of control right now, and it's all related to the food systems. So we are stuck in a way of doing in this paradigm, this old way of doing. And it's come from an evolution, from an agricultural revolution, an industrial revolution, deindustrialization process, globalization process, and then we're in this new age of transition currently of trying to rethink, what do we do to really, really rebuild our cities? So it's time for this paradigm shift, right? And then this is gonna be intentionally messy and a lot of pictures and overload so you can see what it means to be in a paradigm shift. So the paradigm shift that we keep talking about, Ken has been talking about for 40 years. Orrin Williams, people have been working, he's been nicknamed the crazy guy in the attic because he's been saying the same thing that's always right, but people say, yeah. And then they're like, okay, you're right. Johnny Owens is in the crowd also, who's been at it for a minute. Everybody keep coming back and saying, yeah, you're right. It's about this ecology. How do we have this ecosystem that we actually start building up together? And it's also, somebody mentioned culture. I think it was you, Ken. Culture is not just art. It's not just trend. True culture is the cultivation of a thought that's passed down through generations. So if you break that continuity by erasing who lives there, just disrupting, you don't have a chance to actually cultivate thought. You don't actually have a chance to cultivate the culture. So we're getting this, again, forced amnesia. So it's time for a new approach towards social capital, human capital, and natural capital in the economic paradigm, where we can actually figure out where does this mean? Not just an externality, not just an afterthought. So, what does it mean? Urban agriculture, aquaponics, art, and education. That's our focus. That's what we've been doing with Sweetwater Foundation and our teams and our partnerships through a regenerative placemaking. Just like seeds grow to be plants that grow to bear fruit, that have more seeds for the regenerative processes. That's what we're trying to pattern ourselves off of. So something as simple as seed, soil, water, light that people think about and, yeah, whatever. It's quite complex. It's beautiful. It's amazing. If we really appreciate the process, the regenerative processes of growing a plant. Okay, so into the actual intuition and method and the role of science as we go into this trial and error. Everybody's familiar with something like that. In Chicago, we have a lot of boarded up buildings, a lot of foreclosed properties, warehouses that used to be a legacy of the past, right? An industrialized past that have become empty or unused. So in Milwaukee, one of the co-founders of Sweetwater Foundation is in the back also. Trial and error, bartering. There's a lot of people who have a lot of good skill sets that know how to use the machines, that are unemployed, underemployed. But you start bringing the roofers, the carpenters, the plumbers, the veterans, the academicians, and folks in the neighborhood who care. Find what resources there are, you apply the skill sets, and then all of a sudden within that same space you have an ecosystem that's growing food. And then you try again, learn from your lessons, learn from your mistakes and stumblings, and you refine the process. It's even better when you open source the process, when you can try and figure out how we can all learn really, really rapidly together. So what we've been doing is opening those spaces up to our youth and the next generation who are seeding the future. so that they can begin to tell the teachers what they learn, what they don't learn, if they know how to spell, if they don't know how to spell. It's just through the conversations you start understanding each other. And it becomes an interface and a platform for people to start looking at math very real, practical, science very real and practical. Instead of an abstract periodic table on the wall, now your analysis makes sense for you in terms of your iron and pH, ammonia, nitrite. And you start interjecting art into the process, and then you have science, technology, engineering, art, and math as part of your curriculum. See how we're gaming the rhetoric? And then the sense of ownership. Once you actually grow it, cultivate it, eat it, consume it, share it, repeat it, bam. You find a mentorship process. And then you find somebody in the family that was underemployed, not valued in society, that then finds new value, that finds a new career, a consulting piece. Do you need to build an aquaponics system or a garden or raised bed? I have the skill sets. How much money do you have? Do we figure out how we can work together? Et cetera, et cetera. So the folks that were veterans right across the street that were learning from the kids felt motivated to build their own aquaponics system. And then they began to help out at the schools. And then there's a commercial application of it too. We're trying to figure out what can you do in climates like these where you can grow. I skipped over something. Does everybody know what aquaponics is? I'm assuming. I made an assumption. Sure. It is a recirculating water ecosystem. You feed the fish, they eat, they fertilize the water. The water moves by either by pump or by how you design it to your plants. You have all these little nice bacteria, beneficial bacteria, nitrous amonas, nitrospira, nitrobacter, that are converting the nitrite to a nitrate, if you just appreciate the conditions for them to do that. The nitrate is a food source for the plants, which soak up the nutrients out of the fish water to clean the water to go back to the fish. If you try to exceed your carrying capacity, if you try and build it too fast, too big, don't appreciate the biology, don't appreciate the water chemistry, the system collapses. You will kill your fish, you will kill your ecosystem. So you don't want to rush it. You want to appreciate time. So in this system, for example, when you scale up, we have these tanks with tilapia or perch or koi or what have you. It depends on what you want to grow. The water's going from there to the plants, growing indoors in a greenhouse or with supplemental light to clean the water to go back to the fish. So at Chicago State, on the 9601 South Cottage Grove, we have a shoe warehouse that used to be empty. It was purchased by the university in part of the College of Arts and Sciences, that space. You could easily drive past it, most people do, because it's not something you would notice. You would think it's not in your perception. So the metal racking systems that were in the space from the shoe warehouse utilized, upcycled to become the structures for the system. And then there it is. So we have basil, chard, arugula, lettuce, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, growing in very, very dense manner in a small amount of space with our fish. And all of which goes to chefs, restaurants, for purchase, because then you talk about local economy and how do you build local economy. So we also started a series of small-scale experiments, 5-gallon, 10-gallon, 20-gallon, 30-gallon, 50-gallon, 250, 500, et cetera, to scale it up. So that they're constantly informing us of what you can do inside and what's better inside and then what you can do outside. It's a lot better to use the natural light to scale, but we all live indoors. So there's certain things, if you're eating your lettuce from California, you're shipping water from California. So let's talk about a different conversation, right? So year-round production that becomes a classroom for the kids. And then they can experiment with upcycling water bottles to figure out how to do a vertical system and not a 50-story vertical farm per se. Not yet. We have a lot of space, so we can figure out what we're doing with those waste streams and actually turn them into something else. It becomes a ring and a circle for a place for conversation, to share the conversation, widen circles of conversation, find internships, find new friends, cook a meal together, come up with some kind of artistic process and interpretation of what it is you're doing, share that with other people, and then scale it out. So then that becomes a living classroom. You have to figure out what that means. Who maintains it, who sustains it. The kids that were written off as special ed, ADHD, what have you, that then begin to know how to maintain it, build it, sustain it, learn how to make little businesses off of it, and then for their class they get to eat it. Shifting the conversation. So the last step is when we scaled out and we started looking at what is the role of technology in this process. It actually facilitates the means of communicating with one another. So I am a victim of being obsessed with this thing, right? Because this is, you'll always see me texting or emailing or this or that. But it is great because it does facilitate and foster a way to communicate. So we're looking at open sourcing a number of our experimental designs. We have been with our classes because we want them to tell us the feedback. Yeah, this isn't working, the technology's different, the pump's different. So then we come up with something sexy. That goes into the restaurant, that goes into the penthouse, it goes into something, it breaks that barrier, and then they say, what's the narrative behind this? Oh, this kid who you never thought twice about, or this family you never thought twice about is a person who came up with this innovation that's now in your living room. Future of the kitchen. We can do it any different way you want to, from low end to the high end, however you want to do it. So biomimetic informatics. What are these information systems where we can share this information, influence, inspired by nature, but then looking at how we can look at technology to support it. So what we're doing is this gaming the system with fish, plants, water, design, and build with our digital badges. If you have not heard of the digital badging with MacArthur Mozilla Foundation, it's a new platform of education. We actually, a couple weeks ago, David Build, who's in the Nature Museum, was one of our partners. We're doing this hive mapping cooperative where we're an open science platform where his teens can do something around urban ecosystems here. They can come visit us, and then we have them meet and share information and ideas. So geographically, we're crossing borders, and then they're finding out how to rediscover the city. But there's a platform for this badging where if you might not be the best in the classroom, you're still showing and demonstrating that you're learning over time. So there's a social impact, environmental impact, economic impact across this really, really wide range of users. So the last step, at Perry, 3 years ago, it was an empty site. The city started talking to Ken about how they could revitalize the space, build up the site, and then with his partners from City Farm, built a platform, and then now we're operating a space and we're feeding people in the community, we're welcoming folks, we are partnering to try and figure out how to eradicate some of these empty lots through this Perry Ave community farm. And we have this house that was also sitting on an island by itself that we use it as a canvas to send it as a beacon to people to say, come on in, let's have a conversation at the Think Do Lab, the Think Do House. If you think it, do it. Remix it for an ecological city. Thanks.